There's something unusual about how people talk about biblical history. They often say it with a kind of quiet certainty, as if every event recorded in those ancient pages lines up neatly with what we know about the world. But the moment you start looking closely, not with hostility, just with basic curiosity, the picture shifts. It's like noticing that the frame around a famous painting is crooked, and then realizing the painting itself has colors that don't match anything from the period it supposedly came from. What stands out first isn't that the stories are impossible, it's that they consistently behave like stories created long after the fact by people who needed them to serve a purpose. The narratives aren't shaped by eyewitness memory, but by agenda, politics, myth-making, and the human tendency to patch holes in a worldview rather than question the worldview itself. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Take the earliest sections of the Bible, the ones often assumed to be historical foundations. They read like accounts of ancient kingdoms, migrations, battles, and genealogies stretching back to the very dawn of humanity. Yet the archaeological record doesn't reflect any of it in the way you'd expect if these were actual events. Whole civilizations that supposedly existed at the same time simply don't appear in the ground when you dig. The cities where key stories take place either weren't there yet, were much smaller than described, or never existed in the forms the texts insist they did. It's not just a matter of missing evidence, it's that the patterns of these stories fit a different genre entirely. National origin myths. Many cultures wrote similar tales, blending fragments of memory with inventions meant to explain who they were and why their traditions should be taken seriously. These weren't lies in the malicious sense. They were part of a world where storytelling was the closest thing to a historical record, and where accuracy wasn't the point, survival and identity were. But when a modern reader approaches these stories assuming they're factual, something breaks. You end up expecting a kind of historical precision that ancient writers weren't aiming for. And when those expectations aren't met, people often try to retrofit the stories to reality instead of simply accepting that they don't line up. They redraw maps, reinterpret dates, search deserts for lost armies, and stretch tiny slivers of evidence into massive conclusions. It becomes less about discovering truth and more about protecting a belief that the truth must already be settled. One striking example is the Exodus narrative. It's one of the most famous liberation stories ever told, yet nothing about it fits what we know from Egypt's extensive records. Egypt documented everything from grain inventories to minor border skirmishes, but there's no trace of millions of people departing, no record of plagues devastating the land, no mass graves, no sudden demographic holes where slaves once were. Instead, the people who eventually became the Israelites seem to have emerged from within Canaan itself. They weren't outsiders fleeing Egypt, they were locals forming a new cultural identity. This isn't some fringe interpretation, it's where the evidence points, consistently and repeatedly. But the moment you say that out loud, it becomes clear how much effort has gone into defending the traditional version. Apologists often insist that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But when the absence spans archaeology, written records, settlement patterns, and even population genetics, it stops being a gap and starts being a verdict. And once you recognize that the foundational stories don't hold up historically, everything built on top of them starts to look different. The timeline collapses in strange ways. Characters who supposedly lived centuries apart appear to belong to the same cultural era. Events that are meant to be sequential begin overlapping, borrowing, or contradicting one another. It's like reading a novel where the author forgot what they wrote 2 chapters earlier. What makes this all so fascinating is that it doesn't diminish the literary value of the texts. If anything, it highlights how creative these ancient writers were. They stitched together folklore, oral tradition, political messaging, tribal memory, and moral instruction into something that felt cohesive enough to guide a nation. But when someone insists that every line is historically accurate, the entire structure starts to wobble. The mythic layers, the borrowed motifs, the retroactive moral framing, all of it becomes harder to ignore. The irony is that the stories often make more sense when you accept that they aren't historical. Suddenly you can see why certain miracles appear exactly where they do, why particular villains resemble neighboring cultures, why timelines expand or contract depending on what point the writer is trying to make. It's no longer confusing when events from different centuries are blended into one narrative. You're not dealing with history, you're dealing with storytelling that was trying to hold a community together. And then the pattern repeats in the later books, especially when you reach the era where written history actually exists in abundance. Even then, the biblical narratives frequently conflict with external records. Kings are given reign lengths that don't line up. Wars are described that no one else mentions, and major events known from archaeology are framed in ways that match theology more than politics. Yet the most revealing part isn't the errors, it's how confidently those errors are presented, as if the writers expected their audience to accept these narratives not because they were verifiable, but because they were meaningful. That confidence shows up again in the way the texts merge theology with geopolitics. Nations rise or fall not because of strategic failures, droughts, trade collapses, or internal instability, but because a deity rewards or punishes them. When the Israelites win a battle, it's divine favor. When they lose, it's moral failure. But that pattern doesn't match how ancient history actually played out. The great powers of the region, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, didn't rise because they were righteous or fall because they lost faith. They expanded and contracted because of logistics, military innovation, resources, alliances, and sometimes sheer luck. And yet the biblical authors recast these global movements as if the world revolved around a small hill country population that larger empires barely noticed. It's understandable from a narrative perspective. Every group wants to see itself at the center of events, but when you compare these accounts with the records left by the civilizations that truly dominated the region, the contrast becomes almost uncomfortable. You realize the biblical narratives weren't written from a global view of history. They were written from the inside of a small tribal culture trying to interpret forces far beyond its control. Archaeology confirms this modest reality again and again. Sites described as bustling kingdoms turn out to have been tiny highland villages. Monumental cities claimed as conquered show no layer of destruction from the period in question. And inscriptions from neighboring powers often don't acknowledge the events the biblical writers present as major turning points. It's not that these writers were lying, it's more that they were crafting meaning in an age where meaning mattered more than chronological detail. Things become even more tangled when the stories shift into the era of monarchs. The biblical portrayal of kings like David and Solomon is sweeping, dramatic, and filled with national grandeur. Yet the archaeological footprint of their supposed empire is modest at best. Instead of sprawling palaces and a vast administrative network, we find small fortified towns and scattered evidence of developing statehood. The descriptions of immense wealth, thousands of chariots, and international fame start to look like royal propaganda, written long after the fact to legitimize later rulers. What's fascinating is how consistently traditions exaggerate their origins. Whether it's Rome claiming descent from Trojan heroes or medieval chronicles inflating the achievements of early kings, myth-making becomes a kind of cultural currency. The biblical narratives fit right into that pattern. But because they later came to be read as literal history, the mythic elements became points of debate instead of being appreciated for what they were. Even the way the texts were compiled makes historical reliability unlikely. Different authors, writing in different centuries, with different political and theological priorities, ended up woven together into a single narrative. That patchwork nature explains why laws contradict each other, why genealogies don't align, and why certain stories appear twice with small changes. Modern readers sometimes treat these inconsistencies as puzzles to solve, but they're better understood as artifacts of how ancient texts evolved. And then there's the problem of hindsight. Much of biblical prophecy becomes less mysterious when you realize many of the texts were written after the events they supposedly predict. This isn't unusual in ancient literature. Societies often retroactively wrote divine warnings into their histories to make sense of catastrophes. But when these passages are treated as supernatural forecasts rather than reflective commentary, it creates a false sense of precision. It also makes it difficult for readers to distinguish between historical reflection and narrative embellishment. The New Testament introduces its own set of historical issues. The Gospels describe events that should have left noticeable marks in the historical record: census movements, mass killings, public supernatural displays, earthquakes, graves opening, yet they appear nowhere outside those texts. The writers weren't historians documenting meticulously observed events. They were communities shaping stories around a figure they believed had cosmic significance. That's why the accounts differ so widely in chronology, character roles, and even the central details of the resurrected figure's appearances. Some argue that ancient historians just weren't thorough enough, that gaps in records explain everything. But that argument becomes strained when the gaps are always where the religious claims would need to be. Historians of the time recorded scandals, rebellions, strange omens, philosophical debates, and minor local events. The silence on the most dramatic biblical claims is an absence that grows louder the more you compare sources. Perhaps the most compelling insight comes from sociology. People tend to preserve stories that reinforce identity and discard those that threaten it. That's how oral traditions work. Over time, narratives get polished, inconvenient details fade, and morally satisfying explanations replace ambiguous ones. When you apply that understanding to biblical history, the shape of the text makes sense. The heroic victories, the moral failures, the cycles of punishment and redemption, they reflect how communities explain themselves to themselves. Once you see that pattern, the stories become less mysterious. They start functioning like mirrors held up to the anxieties, hopes, and power struggles of the people who preserved them, not as neutral historical reports, but as reflections of how those communities wanted their past to be remembered. And that, more than anything, reveals why biblical history fails when tested against real history. Not because the people were foolish, but because they were human. They shaped their stories the way humans always have, with emotion, with bias, with selective memory, and with a desire to make sense of a confusing world. When you compare biblical history to what we know from the cultures surrounding it, the contrast grows sharper. Neighboring civilizations, the Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and later the Greeks and Romans, left behind detailed administrative documents, legal codes, trade records, inscriptions, and monuments. Their histories are textured, sometimes messy, but undeniably verifiable. You can track their rulers, wars, economic cycles, and even personal correspondence across centuries with remarkable precision. But when you try to align biblical narratives with that established timeline, the pieces rarely fit. Events that should overlap don't. Names that should appear in foreign records never show up. And when they do appear, the context is often completely different from how the biblical authors framed it. Instead of confirming the stories, these external sources reveal how selectively the biblical writers interpreted the world around them. For example, the Assyrian records mention the kingdom of Israel several times, but always in passing. To one of the most powerful empires of its day, Israel was little more than a regional nuisance or a vassal state. Yet within the biblical text, Israel is portrayed as a nation whose moral significance outweighs its military insignificance. It's a small kingdom wrestling with giants, often losing, yet convinced that the cosmic meaning of those losses transcended the physical reality. You can see a kind of narrative inflation happening here. Victories are celebrated as divine intervention, defeats are reinterpreted as lessons in morality, and moments of geopolitical irrelevance are reframed as proof of chosenness. That's not how history works. That's how communities construct identity when they're struggling for survival. Later, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, the biblical interpretation becomes almost psychological. Instead of framing the catastrophe as a result of imperial expansion, which it was, the writers internalize the trauma as punishment for disobedience. It's a coping mechanism found across cultures. When disaster strikes, people search for meaning, blame, or a moral explanation. But when you read these texts as history, you end up with a narrative that misunderstands the very forces shaping it. Even the return from exile follows a familiar pattern. The Persians allowed many groups to rebuild their temples and re-establish their communities. It wasn't a unique gesture. It was part of a larger imperial policy, designed to stabilize conquered regions. But because the biblical authors were interpreting their experience through a theological lens, it became framed as a specially orchestrated act of divine mercy. Again, the meaning mattered more to them than the historical context. This raises an interesting point about how the human mind processes collective memory. We rarely preserve events exactly as they happened. We preserve the story of how those events made us feel, and over time, those stories evolve until they represent the psychological truth of a community more than the factual truth of the past. That's what myth is, not an intentional deception, but a smoothing of the rough edges of experience. The more you examine biblical history, the more obvious this becomes. In many cases, the stories were written centuries after the supposed events took place. Memories had already transformed into legend. Political agendas shaped the way certain kings were portrayed. Religious reforms altered earlier traditions, rewriting the past to justify new practices. And once the stories gained traction, they became the official version, even if they didn't reflect how things actually unfolded. What makes the situation even more complicated is how later readers treat the text. When modern people insist that every detail must be historically accurate, they inadvertently place expectations on the material that its original authors never had. They create a rigid framework where none existed, and then strain to make the evidence conform to it. This leads to creative explanations, imaginative archaeology, and increasingly fragile arguments meant to defend claims that collapse as soon as you apply basic historical scrutiny. If these narratives were treated the way we treat other ancient myths, as symbolic, meaningful, culturally shaped stories, there wouldn't be a problem. Their value wouldn't diminish. In fact, their literary and psychological power might become easier to appreciate. but the insistence on literal accuracy forces a kind of intellectual tension that doesn't resolve. It pulls the stories into a realm where they simply weren't designed to function. You can see this tension clearly in discussions of miracles, events like the sun standing still, a global flood, or armies struck blind by supernatural means aren't just unsupported by evidence, they contradict what we know about how the world works. Some defenders try to explain these miracles scientifically, while others argue they can't be explained because they're supernatural. But either approach misunderstands the purpose of mythic storytelling. Ancient audiences didn't need miracles to be scientifically plausible. They needed them to reinforce moral themes, cultural identity, and the sense that the universe was responsive to human behavior. When modern readers try to turn these symbolic events into literal history, they end up defending impossibilities, and that defense often becomes more complicated than simply acknowledging that the stories operate in a different literary genre. What's also interesting is how the stories reflect human biases. Heroes are idealized, enemies are caricatured, moral failures are rationalized, and complex political motives are reduced to divine approval or disapproval. These patterns tell us far more about the psychology of ancient communities than about historical events. If anything, biblical narratives are more valuable as windows into the ancient mind than as windows into ancient history. Yet even with all this in mind, there's a deeper issue underneath. When a story is elevated to the status of unquestionable history, it becomes resistant to revision. People invest identity, emotion, and purpose into it, and when evidence challenges it, the reaction is often defensive rather than inquisitive. That resistance isn't born from ignorance, it's born from fear, the fear that re-examining the story will unravel the meaning built around it. In a way, the failure of biblical history is less about factual inaccuracies and more about the human tendency to cling to narratives even when they no longer fit the world we live in. That tension grows sharper when you look at how the biblical timeline intersects with major historical turning points. Periods of turmoil in the region are often portrayed as moral dramas, while stable eras receive far less attention. The narrative pacing follows theological importance, not historical proportion. Events that mattered to empires barely register in the text, while moments that carried symbolic weight for a small community are expanded into sweeping national transformations. This selective memory isn't unique to biblical writers. It's present in every culture. But the difference is that most ancient traditions aren't treated as literal historical records today. We can read Greek myth and appreciate its insight into ancient values without insisting that Zeus literally threw lightning bolts from Mount Olympus. We can read Norse sagas and admire their structure without assuming giants once roamed Scandinavia. But biblical stories remain trapped in a different category, where myth is expected to function as fact. That burden distorts the way people engage with the material. Instead of exploring its meaning, they become preoccupied with defending its accuracy. Instead of recognizing its literary motifs, they treat them as eyewitness accounts, and instead of acknowledging the cultural forces that shaped the text, they elevate it above the very history it claims to describe. One example of this distortion shows up in the attempts to reconcile contradictory chronologies. When two passages describe the same event with incompatible details, readers often generate elaborate theories to harmonize them. But this effort overlooks something fundamental. Ancient writers weren't writing with modern precision. They didn't measure time the way we do. They didn't cross-check sources. They didn't aim for consistency across multiple authors. They were shaping stories for communities, not piecing together legal-grade timelines. Even in the books that appear more historical on the surface, the narrative structure reveals the influence of theological priorities. Victories are exaggerated. Defeats are softened or reframed. Controversial leaders are either rehabilitated into heroes or condemned as villains with supernatural justification. The text presents history as a moral drama rather than a record of events. This approach becomes even more pronounced in moments where the writers try to explain unexpected outcomes. When a seemingly righteous king suffers defeat, the narrative inserts explanations about hidden sins or collective guilt. When an obviously flawed leader enjoys success, the story adds divine patience or temporary favor. These additions aren't historical observations, they're narrative devices meant to keep the worldview coherent. What makes this pattern revealing is how unnecessary it would be if the events were reported purely as history. Actual history doesn't tidy itself for narrative convenience. It doesn't adjust itself to match moral expectations. It's full of contradictions, injustices, randomness, and outcomes that don't align with any clear moral arc. Biblical history avoids that discomfort by rewriting events until they fit the story's internal rules. Another telling sign is the lack of mundane detail. Historical records from the ancient Near East are filled with day-to-day concerns: food production, trade shipments, minor disputes, taxation, disease, weather, census data, and royal decrees. Yet biblical narratives rarely touch on these topics in a practical way. Even when they describe laws or social structures, the framing is theological, not administrative. This absence isn't accidental. The writers were less interested in documenting life and more interested in framing meaning. Their focus was moral instruction, identity formation, and theological coherence. So the stories gravitate toward dramatic encounters, symbolic actions, and moral turning points while skipping the details historians rely on. And when mundane details do appear, they often function symbolically rather than descriptively. Numbers become metaphorical, dates become flexible, names carry thematic meaning, genealogies serve political or narrative purposes rather than accurate lineage tracking. This symbolic use of detail is a hallmark of mythic storytelling, not historical reporting. Yet even with all these clues, people still cling to the idea that biblical history is factual. Part of this comes from cultural tradition. When a story is embedded in a society's foundation challenging, it feels like pulling at threads that could unravel the whole fabric. Another part comes from emotional investment. People build meaning, hope, and identity around the narratives they're taught from childhood. To question those narratives feels like questioning themselves. But there's another layer, one that's rarely discussed. Many people are uneasy with the uncertainty of real history. Actual history is fragmented, ambiguous, and often unsatisfying. It doesn't provide neat moral arcs or guaranteed lessons. It doesn't promise that justice always emerges in the end. Mythic history, on the other hand, offers clarity. It offers meaning. It offers structure in a world that often feels chaotic. This desire for order creates a psychological incentive to treat myth as fact, not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative, a world where events unfold without cosmic oversight, can feel disorienting. Once you recognize that motivation, the resilience of biblical history makes more sense. It's not about the evidence. It's about the comfort of believing the universe is narratively structured, and that comfort can be hard to let go of. However, when you trade factual understanding for emotional reassurance, something important is lost. You stop learning from history and start defending a story. You become less curious and more protective, and you miss the chance to understand the ancient world in all its messy human complexity. That, in a way, is the deepest failure of biblical history. Not simply that it doesn't align with evidence, but that it encourages people to accept a simplified version of the past instead of the real one. It asks for certainty where the world offers nuance. It demands clarity where history offers complexity. And ironically, the real history, the one uncovered through archaeology, anthropology, and critical scholarship, turns out to be far more interesting, far more human, and far more revealing than the one preserved in myth. The more we learn from archaeology, the more the ancient world reveals a depth the biblical writers couldn't have captured because they weren't trying to. Their goal wasn't to record the world as it was, but to explain why their community existed, why it struggled, and why it mattered. And yet, for many people today, these explanations have been mistaken for literal accounts of events, creating a kind of historical illusion where meaning is substituted for evidence. One of the clearest examples of this appears in the way ancient Israel's origins are described. The biblical narrative presents a dramatic, unified emergence, a chosen people guided by divine instruction, distinct from their neighbors, set apart by extraordinary events. But archaeology paints a quieter, more organic picture. Instead of a mass migration or conquest, the early Israelites appear to have been Canaanites who gradually developed a new identity. Their material culture, pottery styles, building layouts, diets, matches the local population far more than it differs. This gradual shift makes sense historically. Identities evolve slowly. They don't erupt fully formed from wilderness wanderings or sudden divine revelations. They grow out of shared struggles, environmental pressures, economic shifts, and political cooperation. Yet the biblical stories transform that long, subtle process into a dramatic origin tale designed to unify a scattered people. When you recognize this, the mythic structure becomes almost elegant. It isn't trying to deceive, it's trying to make sense of identity in a way people could embrace. But when these stories are projected onto history with the expectation of accuracy, the elegance collapses, the contradictions surface, the timelines drift, and the archaeological record quietly contradicts the central claims. Another example comes from the portrayal of neighboring nations. The Bible often describes groups like the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, and Amalekites as inherently antagonistic, defined by perpetual conflict. But external evidence reveals a more complex reality. These groups traded with Israel, intermarried, shared languages and cultural practices, and often lived in long periods of coexistence. Conflict did occur, of course, but not in the absolute, morally polarized way the narratives suggest. This pattern mirrors how many cultures depict their neighbors. Threats are exaggerated, alliances are interpreted as betrayals, and historical tensions are recast as timeless rivalries. These exaggerations help create group cohesion, but they distort the actual patterns of life in the region. Archaeology shows cooperation, where the text shows hostility, shared marketplaces, where the narratives describe armed standoffs, and cultural blending, where the stories insist on sharp boundaries. The failure of biblical history isn't just inconsistency, it's simplification. It compresses complexity into stories that fit a moral structure. But complexity always resurfaces in the evidence. Layers of abandoned settlements reveal economic cycles. Shifts in pottery styles reveal trade routes. Burial practices reveal cultural blending. And suddenly the tidy narrative of moral rise and fall becomes a much more human story of adaptation, struggle, and change. This becomes especially evident in the way kingship is described. The biblical portrayal of certain rulers is strongly influenced by the political agendas of later authors. Kings who supported particular religious reforms are praised, sometimes beyond what evidence supports. Kings who were politically inconvenient for later groups are framed as evil or corrupt. Yet when archaeology uncovers inscriptions, administrative documents, or foreign accounts, the biblical descriptions often fail to match. In some cases, kings celebrated in the text leave almost no archaeological footprint. In others, kings dismissed as failures show up in external records as far more influential than the narratives allow. It's clear that the writers had goals beyond recounting events. They were shaping a theological legacy. They were organizing history into a pattern where divine approval and national success were tied together, even when real history showed no such link. This blending of theology and memory becomes even more apparent when you consider how later editors wove older texts together. Different traditions, sometimes contradictory, were merged into a single storyline. This editorial process explains why some events appear twice with different details, why certain figures are given conflicting genealogies, and why later theological concerns appear retroactively in earlier stories. Instead of reflecting a single historical account, the text reflects centuries of reinterpretation. Each generation adjusted the stories to fit its worldview. Each crisis reshaped the past to offer new lessons, and each political shift influenced which stories were emphasized, softened, or reframed. This evolution is fascinating, but it also undermines the idea that these stories reflect literal events. When the meaning of a story changes based on who is telling it, the stability of its historical claims becomes questionable. Yet perhaps the most striking evidence comes from silence. There are periods where the biblical narrative describes major events that simply don't appear in external records. Entire wars, mass migrations, and sweeping reforms go unnoticed by neighboring civilizations that documented even minor regional disruptions. These gaps aren't a matter of incomplete evidence. They form patterns that reveal the difference between narrative imagination and historical reality. But what's equally striking are the events that do appear in external records but are missing from the biblical narrative. Droughts, invasions, shifting empires, famines, and large-scale migrations reshaped the region, yet many of these events barely appear in the text. The omissions reveal what mattered to the writers, not global forces but moral storytelling, not geopolitical movements but narrative arcs. This narrow focus creates a kind of historical tunnel vision. It turns the ancient world into a stage where a single community plays the lead role, even as empires rise and fall around them. But when you widen the lens, the biblical narrative becomes a small thread in a vast tapestry, compelling, culturally rich, but not historically dominant. Recognizing this doesn't diminish the value of the text, it clarifies it. These stories weren't written to satisfy historians. They were written to satisfy identity, meaning, and belonging. And the real world, uncovered piece by piece through evidence, reflects a complexity that myth can't fully capture. In that complexity, you find something the biblical history can't offer, a record shaped not by theology but by the realities of human life. That complexity is where real historical inquiry becomes fascinating. When we follow the evidence without imposing a pre-existing narrative, we discover how dynamic and interconnected the ancient Near East really was. Trade networks spanned hundreds of miles. Cities rose and fell for economic, climatic, or military reasons. Peoples migrated not because of divine command, but because of opportunity, pressure, or necessity. And through all of this, communities adapted in ways that were creative, pragmatic, and sometimes brutal. In contrast, the biblical stories simplify this dynamism into moral lessons. Leaders are rewarded or punished based on obedience or sin. Cities rise and fall in response to divine will rather than resource management or conflict with neighbors. Whole civilizations are portrayed as morally corrupt, wiped out as cosmic lessons when the reality was far more complex. The biblical lens flattens nuance into archetypes, turning history into narrative shorthand. Take, for example, the conquest of Canaan. The biblical account describes sweeping victories and a systematic removal of inhabitants. Archaeological evidence, however, reveals a much more gradual and uneven process. Some cities show evidence of violent destruction, but others remain intact. Some populations appear to have assimilated rather than vanished. And there's no sign of a coordinated, rapid campaign that could match the biblical timeline. The historical truth is far messier, not a single divine-led campaign, but a mosaic of local conflicts, migration patterns, and cultural shifts. This discrepancy illustrates the larger principle at work. Biblical writers weren't aiming to record precise events. They were creating a moral framework. They used history selectively, emphasizing or downplaying details to make theological points. They turned ambiguity into clarity, coincidence into divine purpose, and complexity into digestible lessons for their communities. Even small details reflect this approach. Numbers in the text often stretch beyond plausibility. Armies counted in the hundreds of thousands, lifespans extending well beyond natural limits, or miraculous provisions feeding enormous populations with minimal resources. These details aren't random, they're symbolic, reinforcing the impression that the stories operate on a different plane of significance than ordinary events. Literal interpretation of these figures leads to absurdity, but understood as literary devices, they reveal narrative priorities. Another revealing aspect is the selective preservation of events. Catastrophes that reinforce the moral arc are highlighted. Ambiguous failures or inconvenient truths are minimized or ignored. For instance, political instability, internal dissent, and failed rebellions receive little attention, while triumphs and divinely framed lessons dominate the narrative. The text becomes a curated history, emphasizing the moral order rather than the messy reality of human experience. Even the portrayal of foreign powers serves narrative aims rather than historical accuracy. Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt are often reduced to archetypes, oppressors, instruments of divine judgment, or foils to Israelite virtue. The nuances of diplomacy, trade, cultural exchange, and intermarriage are frequently ignored. The biblical perspective frames the ancient world in terms of morality rather than causality, and that framing distorts historical understanding. Yet these distortions aren't accidental. They reveal the human need to make sense of chaos. Societies craft stories to explain victories and defeats, to justify practices, and to establish identity. The biblical texts are part of this global pattern of myth-making, where symbolic truth takes precedence over factual accuracy, and they succeed remarkably well at what they were designed to do: provide cohesion, offer moral guidance, and foster community. The problem arises only when those purposes are mistaken for historical documentation. Psychologically, this explains why biblical history continues to be defended so vigorously. People aren't merely protecting a text, they're protecting a framework for understanding the world. Accepting the stories as purely symbolic requires confronting uncertainty and complexity. It requires acknowledging that human communities survive not because of divine oversight, but through adaptability, cooperation, and occasionally ruthless pragmatism. That realization can be uncomfortable, even unsettling. Another striking insight comes from comparing biblical history to other ancient literatures. Greek, Roman, and Mesopotamian texts frequently blend myth and memory, exaggeration, and selective reporting. But these traditions are rarely treated as factual accounts today. They are appreciated as sources of cultural, moral, and literary insight rather than blueprints of actual events. The biblical texts, however, often occupy a special status where myth is expected to function as historical proof. That expectation creates tension whenever the narrative is compared to evidence. Once you examine it this way, a pattern emerges across the entire Bible. Stories are curated, edited, and interpreted to serve identity and moral teaching. Chronologies are flexible, numbers are symbolic, miracles are amplified, political realities are reframed in moral terms, and historical gaps are filled with narrative invention. That isn't evidence of negligence or deceit, it's evidence of intent, of storytelling designed to convey meaning rather than literal events. In essence, the failure of biblical history isn't a simple matter of inaccuracy. It's a mismatch between expectations and purpose. Ancient writers were not historians in the modern sense. They were narrators, moral philosophers, and cultural archivists. When we read the texts expecting precise timelines, verifiable records, and causal clarity, failure becomes inevitable. But when we read them for their intended purpose, they succeed beautifully as guides to human belief, fear, ambition, and creativity. Understanding this helps explain why biblical history often seems to fail on its own terms. The stories were never meant to be forensic records of the past. They were meant to explain, to instruct, to unify, and to instill meaning. The repeated failures, chronological inconsistencies, missing archaeological evidence, exaggerated numbers, and selective storytelling are not mistakes in the modern sense. They are features of a narrative crafted to serve purposes other than factual accuracy. When you step back, the cumulative effect is striking. Every layer of the text, from Genesis to Kings, from the prophets to chronicles, reveals the same patterns, a moral framework superimposed on a patchwork of memory and imagination, edited over centuries to reflect the evolving needs of a community, shaped by politics, culture, and theology. And yet, despite these inconsistencies, the stories endure. People continue to tell them, study them, debate them, and use them to anchor their understanding of identity and morality. But the endurance of these texts also illustrates a deeper lesson about human thinking. We are wired to seek patterns, to find causation, to link events to meaning. When we encounter ambiguity or randomness, we instinctively impose order. Biblical history exploits this tendency beautifully. It offers a coherent narrative where real events were complex, messy, and often inexplicable. It transforms chaos into story, uncertainty into lesson, randomness into morality. In that sense, the failure of biblical history is paradoxical. It fails as a record of events, yet it succeeds as a mirror of human thought. It exposes the ways in which communities construct reality, reinforce identity, and impose moral coherence on an unpredictable world. And for modern readers, recognizing that duality is liberating, it frees us to appreciate the text not for its factual claims, but for its insight into human psychology, culture, and social evolution. At the same time, confronting this failure is also humbling. It reminds us how carefully we must approach history, evidence, and narrative. It teaches the value of skepticism, critical thinking, and interdisciplinary study. Archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and comparative literature all become essential tools when reconstructing the past. And it shows that human understanding grows not by blindly accepting stories, but by questioning, investigating, and revising our interpretations based on evidence. Perhaps most importantly, recognizing the difference between mythic and factual history allows us to appreciate both without confusion. Myths provide meaning, moral structure, and cultural identity. Facts provide clarity, causality, and evidence-based understanding. Confusing the two leads to frustration, misinterpretation, and endless debate. But separating them allows each to function as it should, one as a lens into the human mind, the other as a map of the real world. And so, when we say that nothing fails like Bible history, it isn't merely a critique of accuracy. It's a recognition of expectation versus design. The texts were never intended to survive as modern historical documentation. They were intended to survive as narratives that guided human communities through uncertainty, fear, and moral decision-making. In that context, their failure is entirely predictable and entirely human. In the end, the story that emerges from scrutiny is more nuanced and compelling than the story the text itself claims to be. It is a story of people navigating real dangers and uncertainties, of communities shaping memory into meaning, of writers creating symbolic coherence from the chaos of life. It is a story not of divine orchestration, but of human creativity, resilience, and the deep-seated need to make sense of the past. And perhaps that is the most fascinating revelation of all, that even when history fails to match the stories themselves reveal truths about human nature, about our desire to explain, to teach, and to find significance in a vast, complex, and often unpredictable world. The biblical texts may not succeed as historical records, but they succeed brilliantly as reflections of humanity itself,